The night before the wedding, Norma Jeane couldn't sleep. Not because of bridal excitement or romantic anticipation, but because she kept having the same recurring nightmare that had haunted her since childhood. In the dream, she's back at the Los Angeles Orphanage home, standing at the chain-link fence, watching cars drive by, waiting for a mother who never comes. She'd lived that reality for 2 years in the 1930s, after her mother Gladys was institutionalized for mental illness. The abandonment, the institutional cruelty, the feeling of being fundamentally unwanted, these wounds never healed. So when Grace Goddard sat her down in June 1942 and explained that the family was moving to West Virginia without her, 16-year-old Norma Jeane felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The choice was immediate and brutal: marry James Dougherty or go back to the orphanage. There was no time to think, no room to dream, no space to be a child. And so, on June 19, 1942, Norma Jeane Baker became Mrs. James Dougherty, a teenage bride who walked down the aisle not toward love, but away from trauma. The girl who would become Marilyn Monroe learned that day that survival sometimes means marrying your escape route, and for the next 4 years she would play the role of dutiful young wife while secretly planning the transformation that would change everything, the metamorphosis from trapped teenage bride to the most desired woman in the world. This is the story Hollywood never wanted you to know. Marilyn Monroe's journey to stardom didn't begin with a screen test. It began with a 16-year-old girl calculating her survival in a world that gave her no other choice. Before we continue with this untold story, if you appreciate deep dives into the hidden truths behind Hollywood's greatest legends, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. The story you're about to hear has been buried for decades, and it reveals a side of Marilyn Monroe that the studio system worked hard to erase. The conversation happened on a Tuesday afternoon in early June 1942. Norma Jeane Baker sat on the floral-patterned sofa in Grace Goddard's modest Los Angeles home, her hands folded in her lap the way she'd been taught at the orphanage: quiet, compliant, invisible. Grace Goddard wasn't a cruel woman, but she had a problem. Her husband Irvin had received a job transfer to West Virginia, and they couldn't take their 16-year-old foster daughter with them. Grace explained it carefully, the way adults do when they're about to destroy a child's world but want to pretend they're being reasonable. The state regulations were complicated. The paperwork would take months. The cost was prohibitive. These were the practical reasons, delivered in a calm voice that made them sound inevitable. But Norma Jeane heard the real message underneath: you are too much trouble to keep. The 16-year-old girl didn't cry. She'd learned years ago that crying didn't change anything. Instead, she asked the question burning in her chest, even though she already knew the answer. Where would she go? Grace Goddard's pause before answering told Norma Jeane everything. The Los Angeles Orphanage Home Society still had her file. They could take her back. It would only be temporary, Grace assured her. But both women knew what temporary meant in the foster care system, however long it took for someone to want you, and sometimes that meant forever. Norma Jeane had spent 1935 and 1936 in that institution, 2 years that had carved themselves into her psyche with institutional precision. She remembered the smell of industrial soap and boiled vegetables. She remembered the rows of metal beds and the sound of girls crying into thin pillows. She remembered the shame of wearing donated clothes that never quite fit, and the way the staff looked through you rather than at you, as if you were already a ghost. Most of all, she remembered the fence, chain-link and impossibly high, and how she'd stand there every Saturday watching families drive by on their way to somewhere that wasn't an orphanage. Going back there wasn't an option. It was a death sentence for the soul, and Norma Jeane Baker would do anything to avoid it. That's when Grace Goddard offered the alternative. The Dougherty family lived next door, and their son James had recently turned 21. He worked at Lockheed Aircraft, made decent money, seemed responsible. Grace had already spoken to his mother Ethel. The families had discussed it. If Norma Jeane was willing, James Dougherty would marry her. It would solve everyone's problem. Norma Jeane wouldn't have to go back to the orphanage. The Goddards could move with clear consciences, and James would get a pretty young wife who'd be grateful for the rescue. Except that 16-year-old Norma Jeane wasn't thinking about gratitude. She was thinking about survival. Marriage to a stranger was better than institutional hell. At least in marriage, there might be a door she could open later. The orphanage had no doors, no chances, no future. So Norma Jeane Baker said yes to James Dougherty's proposal before James Dougherty even knew he was proposing. James Dougherty was 21 years old, dark-haired, and by all accounts a decent guy who worked hard and didn't cause trouble. When his mother told him about the Goddard girl needing help, James didn't immediately jump at marrying a teenager he barely knew. But Ethel Dougherty was persistent. The girl needed help. James was in a position to do something decent, and besides, Norma Jeane was very pretty. It wouldn't exactly be a sacrifice. The wedding was scheduled for June 1942, less than 3 weeks after that initial conversation. There was no engagement ring, no romantic proposal, no slow build of excitement. There was an appointment at the courthouse for the marriage license, a borrowed dress, and a gathering of fewer than 20 people. Chester Howell, a family friend, would perform the ceremony in his home on South Bentley Avenue. The whole thing cost less than $50. This was marriage as solution, wedding as paperwork, love as something that might develop later if everyone was lucky. The morning of her wedding, Norma Jeane woke up at the Goddard house for the last time. She lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. In 6 hours, she would be a married woman. In 6 hours, her childhood would officially end. She wasn't nervous the way brides are supposed to be nervous. She was calculating. The ceremony was brief and awkward. James Dougherty stood at the makeshift altar in his best suit, looking simultaneously proud and uncertain. Norma Jeane stood beside him in her borrowed ballerina-length white dress, holding a bouquet someone had picked up that morning. Grace Goddard cried, performing the role of emotional mother figure, and Norma Jeane Baker spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice that gave no hint of the calculations running through her head. She promised to love, honor, and obey. She promised things she had no intention of keeping the moment a better option appeared. But that was fine, because everyone in that room was performing. Grace was performing relief, James was performing gallant rescuer, and Norma Jeane was performing gratitude, compliance, and hope for a future she knew she'd have to build herself. The wedding photographer captured the moment. In the photos, Norma Jeane is smiling. It's a pretty smile, carefully composed, the smile of a girl who'd already learned that beauty could be weaponized. She looks happy in those photos, but if you look closely, you can see the calculation behind her eyes. You can see a 16-year-old girl who's just traded one cage for another, hoping that this one has a door she can open when she's ready. But here's what nobody at that wedding understood. Norma Jeane Baker wasn't getting married. She was buying time. And she was about to use those next 4 years to transform herself so completely that by the time she was ready to leave James Dougherty, he wouldn't even recognize the woman he'd married. James and Norma Jeane moved into a small apartment in the San Fernando Valley. For the first months, they played at domesticity with all the awkwardness of actors reading from a script they hadn't memorized. James went to work every morning, came home expecting dinner and a smiling wife. Norma Jeane cooked meals, cleaned the apartment, and performed the role of young wife with careful attention. But beneath the performance, she was restless. At 16, she was legally married, legally an adult, but she didn't feel like any of those things. She felt like a girl playing dress-up, waiting for real life to begin. For James, this was real life, the goal. For Norma Jeane, this was temporary, a holding pattern, survival rather than destination. Then came 1943, and with it World War II escalation that would inadvertently hand Norma Jeane the beginning of her escape route. James Dougherty, like millions of young men, faced being drafted or enlisting. In March 1943, he chose the Merchant Marine. The decision was presented to Norma Jeane as already made. James was going to serve his country. She would stay in Los Angeles, move in with his parents. Everything would be fine. It was temporary. But temporary for James meant different things than temporary for Norma Jeane. James left for training in early 1943, and Norma Jeane moved in with his mother Ethel in North Hollywood. The arrangement should have been stifling, a teenage girl living under her mother-in-law's supervision. But what Ethel didn't understand was that supervision only works when the person being supervised wants to comply. Living with Ethel meant restrictions, but it also meant something Norma Jeane hadn't anticipated: freedom from James. Without her husband coming home every night, Norma Jeane had time. Time to think, time to read, time to imagine futures that didn't include being Mrs. James Dougherty forever. She got a job at the radio plane munitions factory in Burbank in 1944, inspecting parachutes and spraying fuselage parts. It was wartime work, and it paid better than anything Norma Jeane had ever earned. More importantly, it got her out of Ethel's house 8 to 10 hours a day. At the factory, she wasn't James Dougherty's teenage wife or the orphan with the institutionalized mother. She was Norma Jeane, one worker among hundreds, anonymous in the best possible way. The other women at the factory liked her. She was pretty but not stuck up, worked hard, made people laugh. For the first time, Norma Jeane experienced something close to normal social belonging. These weren't foster families who could send her back. These were peers who treated her like an equal. The man's name was David Conover, and he was a photographer for the U.S. Army's 1st Motion Picture Unit. His assignment was straightforward: produce photographs of women working in defense plants for magazine publication. Standard propaganda shots, Rosie the Riveter imagery, morale-building content. Conover arrived at the radio plane factory in June 1944 with standard expectations. Then he saw Norma Jeane. Years later, Conover would describe that moment with breathless drama, talking about how she glowed under the factory lights, how the camera loved her. Strip away the self-aggrandizement, and what remains is probably true. Norma Jeane was uncommonly photogenic. More than that, she had an intuitive understanding of how to position herself, how to angle her face, how to create intimacy through a camera lens. These weren't taught skills. They were survival adaptations, the same tools she'd been using all her life to make people like her, want her, choose to keep her. Conover took several shots that day, and then he did something unusual. He asked if she'd be interested in additional photographic work. He gave her his contact information. He suggested she might have a future in modeling. For most women at that factory, such a suggestion would have been flattering but impractical. But Norma Jeane heard opportunity knocking, and she'd been waiting for that sound her entire life. She contacted Conover after his visit. She posed for additional photographs, and through his connections she was introduced to the idea that her face might be valuable, that beauty could be commodified, that there might be a door out of the factory and out of the marriage that didn't lead back to the orphanage. By late 1944 and early 1945, Norma Jeane was doing occasional modeling work. Nothing major yet, but enough to understand that this was a possible path forward, a way to transform from anonymous factory worker to someone who mattered. The problem was James, or rather the problem was the marriage. James was overseas, writing letters about their future together, about the house they'd buy, about the children they'd have. He was constructing a fantasy of post-war domestic happiness that had no relationship to what Norma Jeane actually wanted. And Norma Jeane, reading those letters, understood she was approaching a crossroads. When James came back, he would expect to resume their marriage exactly where they'd left off. He would expect her to quit whatever job she had, focus on being his wife, start having babies. And that was the one thing she absolutely could not do. The calculation she'd made at 16 was reaching its conclusion. Marriage to James had served its purpose. It had kept her out of the orphanage, given her time to mature. But now the cost was becoming clear. Staying married meant giving up any possibility of becoming someone else. But the path forward required leaving James behind, and that conversation was approaching faster than Norma Jeane wanted to admit. In August 1945, Norma Jeane took a step that would have been unthinkable years earlier. She enrolled at the Blue Book Model Agency, run by Emmeline Snively, a businesswoman who understood that modeling wasn't just about being pretty, it was about marketing beauty, performing femininity, becoming a product. Snively saw potential in Norma Jeane, but also saw work that needed to be done. The girl was too heavy by modeling standards. Her hair was mousy brown. She needed training in posture, movement, makeup. She needed to learn the difference between being naturally pretty and being professionally beautiful. And most importantly, she needed to decide if she was serious. Norma Jeane was serious, more serious than she'd been about anything except survival itself. She absorbed Snively's instruction with intensity. She went on a diet, losing 15 pounds. She spent money she couldn't afford on hair appointments, experimenting with lighter shades. She practiced poses in mirrors, studied fashion magazines, learned to move her body in ways the camera found compelling. The modeling work required elaborate lies about extra factory shifts or visits with girlfriends. Norma Jeane was juggling 3 identities: dutiful wife writing letters to James overseas, compliant daughter-in-law living with Ethel, and aspiring model building a portfolio. The strain was exhausting, but she'd been doing this kind of juggling her entire life. By early 1946, Norma Jeane had a respectable portfolio. She wasn't famous or particularly successful yet, but she was working consistently. More importantly, she was making connections, meeting photographers, makeup artists, other models. She was learning how the entertainment industry worked from people actually in it. She learned that success in modeling could lead to screen tests. She learned that Hollywood was always looking for beautiful young women, and that beauty plus ambition plus willingness to endure rejection might get you somewhere. And Norma Jeane absorbed all of this, building a mental roadmap of transformation. The problem was that the path forward required leaving James behind. Throughout 1945 and into early 1946, letters crossed the Pacific in both directions, carrying 2 completely different visions of the future. James wrote from China, about missing home, about his plans for after the war. He wanted to buy a house, have kids, settle into stable suburban life. He wrote with the confidence of a man who'd served his country and expected to come home to a grateful wife. Norma Jeane's letters, in response, were carefully crafted performances of wifely devotion, stripped of any content that might reveal her actual life. She didn't write about the modeling work consuming her time. She didn't write about photographers noticing her. She didn't write about lying awake, terrified that James would come home and all of this would disappear. When James Dougherty returned to Los Angeles in early 1946, he expected to find the life he'd left behind waiting. What he found was a stranger, wearing his wife's face. Norma Jeane met him at the dock with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. James, exhausted and disoriented, initially didn't notice the distance. They moved back into their apartment. Everything should have clicked back into place, but nothing fit because Norma Jeane had changed. The first major conflict came within weeks. Norma Jeane mentioned casually that she'd been doing modeling work. Just small jobs, she said, testing his reaction. His reaction was immediate and predictable. He didn't like it. He didn't like other men photographing his wife. He didn't understand why she'd want to do that when he was home, now earning good money. He framed his concerns as protection. But what Norma Jeane heard was control. The arguments escalated throughout spring and summer 1946. James wanted her to quit modeling. Norma Jeane refused. James suggested starting a family. Norma Jeane deflected. James talked about buying a house, settling down. Norma Jeane smiled and agreed, then continued pursuing photographic work with increasing dedication. But this time, the strategy was reaching its limits. James was starting to understand that something fundamental had changed. One of their worst fights happened when James came home early and found Norma Jeane getting ready for a photo shoot. She was wearing makeup he'd never seen, her hair styled differently. She was standing in front of the mirror practicing poses, expressions, movements, and James, watching from the doorway, finally understood he'd already lost her. She wasn't his wife anymore. She was an actress rehearsing a role, and the role didn't include him. He tried different tactics. He tried forbidding her from continuing. She ignored him. He tried reasoning about how this was damaging their marriage. She agreed but continued anyway. Finally, in desperate frustration, he gave her an ultimatum: choose him or choose the modeling career. It was the worst tactical mistake he could have made, because Norma Jeane had been waiting for exactly that choice. She chose the modeling career. She chose possibility over safety. And in doing so, she broke James Dougherty's heart, though she would argue decades later that you can't break someone's heart when they never really knew you in the first place. In September 1946, less than 6 months after James returned from overseas, Norma Jeane filed for divorce. The legal grounds were mental cruelty. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was just paperwork and a quiet dissolution of a marriage that had only ever been a survival strategy. Even as the marriage was ending, Norma Jeane was already transforming into someone who bore only superficial resemblance to the teenage bride from 1942. The work with Blue Book had opened doors, and she was walking through every one. Most dramatically, she was transforming her appearance. The brown hair was history. She'd begun the process of becoming platinum blonde, that particular shade Hollywood photographers loved. The process was brutal, repeated bleaching sessions that damaged her hair and scalp, but Norma Jeane endured it because transformation always hurts. In July 1946, still technically married but already planning her exit, Norma Jeane got a screen test with 20th Century Fox. She prepared obsessively, practicing the scene until she could perform it in her sleep. The test itself was brief, maybe 5 minutes. She didn't do anything revolutionary, but she did something the camera found irresistible. She was present, vulnerable, luminous, in a way that transcended technical skill. On August 26, 1946, Fox offered Norma Jeane a 6-month contract at $75 a week. It wasn't a star contract, just a standard training contract the studio offered to dozens of hopefuls. But to Norma Jeane, it was vindication. It was proof she'd been right to risk everything, right to choose ambition over safety, right to end her marriage, because now she had a studio contract. Now she was officially part of Hollywood. Now she could become someone else. The first thing the studio did was change her name. Norma Jeane Baker Dougherty. Too long, too ordinary, too unmarketable. They needed something with star quality. The studio executives went through various options, eventually landing on Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn came from a Broadway actress they admired. Monroe was her mother's maiden name. On her first day as a contract player at Fox, Norma Jeane Baker Dougherty walked through the studio gates for the last time. The woman who walked out at the end of the day was Marilyn Monroe. Same body, same face, same survival instincts, but a different person legally, professionally, and increasingly psychologically. The transformation that had begun in 1942 with a desperate 16-year-old's decision to marry a stranger was reaching its next phase. Marilyn Monroe was going to be everything Norma Jeane Baker had never been allowed to be: desired, powerful, famous, rich, and most importantly, free. The cost of that freedom was a marriage ended and a young man's heart broken. But Norma Jeane had learned long ago that survival requires calculation, and sometimes the price of becoming who you need to become is leaving behind who you were. James Dougherty never forgave her, not really. Years later, he would give interviews and write memoirs about his time with Norma Jeane. He would describe a sweet, innocent girl corrupted by Hollywood. He would claim the real woman he'd married had been destroyed by fame. But here's the truth James Dougherty never understood. Norma Jeane Baker wasn't destroyed by Hollywood. She was created by it. And the girl he'd married in 1942 had never been real in the first place. She'd been a performance, a survival strategy, a temporary identity adopted by a 16-year-old who knew that sometimes you have to become what people want you to be until you're strong enough to become what you want to be. Marilyn Monroe was what Norma Jeane wanted to be, and she was willing to sacrifice everything to make it happen. The years following the divorce saw two completely different trajectories. James remarried in 1947, had children, joined the Los Angeles Police Department, lived the solid, respectable life of a mid-century American man. His connection to Marilyn Monroe would become the most interesting thing about him. Meanwhile, the woman who'd been his wife was becoming an international phenomenon. Marilyn's career had fits and starts initially. The first Fox contract was dropped. She struggled, worked as a model, eventually signed with Columbia, then Fox again. But by 1950, she'd landed memorable roles. By 1952, she was a rising star. By 1953, she was famous. By 1955, she was an icon. One revealing moment came in 1954 when James was working as an LAPD officer, providing security at a Hollywood premiere starring his ex-wife. James stood in his police uniform, controlling crowds, watching as Marilyn Monroe emerged from a limousine in a stunning gown, photographers exploding with flashbulbs, fans screaming. For a moment, their eyes met. James in his uniform, representing law and order. Marilyn in her gown, representing glamour and everything beyond normal life. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. He was her past. She was her future. They existed in completely different universes now. When Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her Brentwood home on August 5, 1962, at just 36 years old, the news shocked the world. Joe DiMaggio, her second husband, took control of the funeral and would send roses to her grave for 20 years. But James Dougherty stayed away. He didn't attend the funeral. He didn't make public statements. Years later, when asked why, James said it would have been too painful, but maybe the real reason was simpler. He hadn't been invited into that part of her life. He'd been left behind in 1946. In the decades after her death, James became a reluctant authority on Marilyn's early life, giving interviews, appearing on television, eventually writing a book. In all these accounts, he portrayed himself as someone who genuinely loved Norma Jeane, who'd tried to give her stability, who'd been hurt when she chose fame. And maybe that's all true. Maybe James did love the version of Norma Jeane he thought he knew, but he never understood that the girl he'd married had been performing for him the same way she performed for everyone else, that authenticity was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. The marriage that had saved 16-year-old Norma Jeane from the orphanage was in the end just a stepping stone in a transformation that would take a scared foster child and turn her into one of the most famous women in history. And in choosing marriage over the orphanage, in using that marriage as temporary shelter while she figured out how to become someone else, she set in motion a transformation that would change Hollywood, redefine beauty and sexuality, and create a legend that would outlive her by decades. The girl who walked down the aisle on June 19, 1942, in a borrowed dress, marrying a man she barely knew, was already calculating her escape. And when she finally escaped, when she walked out of that marriage and into the camera lights, she never looked back.